I'm here today with Bill Reynolds, who is the president of Alamar Media. And Bill, your career is so expansive in the Western industry that we could probably spend several days talking about everything that you've got going on. But today we're going to visit specifically about Arnold Rojas and the books that you have republished, written by him. So tell us a little bit about how that came about. Tell us the story there.
Well, thanks, Emily, for having me on. It's wonderful, and I think you're doing such a great job with this new entrance into media. It's the Western industry, and certainly the horse business needs it. So this is great. I first became aware of Arnold Rojas in the early 80s. I had read about him in some books of essays by a Central Valley writer by the name of Gerald Haslam, who has written a number of books. He's passed away in 2021, but he had written a number of books of essays about the people and places of the Central Valley and why it was important and unique. And he had written a little essay about meeting Arnold Rojas in the early 50s that I had read. And then I had the opportunity to go to one of the very early vaquero shows that were put on out here in Santa Paula, which was effectively a bit and spur show before all the big bit and spur shows started, and people would come and trade out of the back of their car. And Rojas was quite ill. They brought him in on a bed and sat him down next to his books. And this is 1984, I think. And he passed away in 1988. But I got to meet him and chat with him, and he was just sharp as a tack. But I bought his books, and he signed a bunch of them. And as time went on, I realized that they were all disappearing, or they were going onto eBay for ridiculously big prices, $250 for a book that was $8. So I thought, with so much interest growing in the vaquero culture, we needed to make them available to new generations at reasonable prices. That was the complete impetus for why I did it. But it took me a lot longer than I had ever imagined to be able to publish them. His daughter, Juanita Montez, had retained the copyrights of all of his books, and I had gone around and about contacting her. She lived in Taft, California, which is very close to Bakersfield. And we started corresponding back and forth, and she was very untrusting. Frankly, she was very untrusting of a white guy with a big media company saying, I'm going to republish your books and give you a royalty. Took 10 years of talking with her. And finally, I invited her to one of the current vaquero shows at the Santa Ynez Historical Museum. And we sat and chatted, and we shook hands, and we went off from there. So I told her I would republish them exactly as they were, because they had a number of publishers and printers when he first started doing that in the early 50s. And I just, we kind of shared blood, and I said, well, I hope you own the copyrights, because this could be a wreck. But so far, it's been good. Juanita passed away 5 or 6 years ago, and so her daughter Mackenzie Montez is the royalty recipient now. And I talked to an aunt, and this is all in Taft, California. It's all just an interesting relationship. And I guess it never was designed to be a moneymaker. It was designed to make his memory not disappear. It's why I did the book on Jody Young. None of these things none of these things are Tom Clancy novels. So it's really about maintaining certain traditions. And certainly the vaquero culture is very tradition based in many, many ways. Some of them are not great. I mean, I don't think the people who are familiar with Louis Ortega's books, I don't think anybody's going to do hackamore horses like that anymore. But it's still an important brick in the wall of what the culture is about. So that was the reason why I did it and why I continue to do it. And they people suddenly become aware of him and read a lot about him.
Do you remember, I mean, when you pick up, it's so amazing that you got to meet him when he was still alive, and when you pick up the books and you start to read, like, his voice just jumps off the page, but it's this rich history, and so it's like getting to have this front row seat to sitting around the kitchen table to the old guys sharing stories, and it's just amazing.
Well, he says he didn't write any of the books. These are all stories that he was told by people he worked with. I mean, for a fellow who was, he was born in 1896, in Pasadena, California. He was orphaned at 6 years old and sent to an orphanage in San Luis Obispo. And that story in itself, I never found out why somebody hauled him from Pasadena to San Luis Obispo, but he was there till he was 12 and he ran away because he wanted to be, as he described it, a ranch rider. And so he started at 12 years old. It was a very acceptable thing for people to work on ranches. And he was making $1 a month when he started out. And as he said, I couldn't spend it all, which I think is pretty funny. Ultimately, he ended up on the Tejon Ranch, where he worked for 25 years under J.J. Lopez, who was the Tejon's longest running ranch manager. I think it was from 1874 to 1938. He managed the Tejon, which that's a pretty good run. But ultimately, he learned a lot of this stuff from the vaqueros who worked on the Tejon. And early on, the Tejon shared a fence line with parts of Miller and Lux, which is mind-blowing to me, that you could talk across a fence on these two ranches back then in the early 1900s. But in 1935, he moved back to Bakersfield, opened a stable, and started floating teeth. And he stayed there for quite a while. And that's where he started writing, primarily because the Bakersfield, California newspaper was sponsoring a rodeo, and they needed somebody to write ad copy about the rodeo. So he was holding on to one of the horses of this, the editor of the magazine, and he wrote the ad copy, and it was so compelling that he started writing columns for the newspaper.
Wow.
And that's really how it started. It was absolutely, when you think that Arnold Rojas started writing ad copy for books, that's pretty good.
Yeah, so, that's amazing.
So the first book was Lore of the Cowboy. I'll do this here.
Perfect. Yeah.
And it was 1953, and that was the beginning of it. He wrote 3 books in the 50s, a couple in the 60s. He wrote a total of 7 books. The last 2, which are the real big ones, here. The last book he wrote was Vaqueros and Buckaroos, which is like a phone book, and they're compilations of a lot of his stories. He was writing an 8th book at the time he died, and Gerald Haslam, who had met him so much earlier, put him in touch with a fellow by the name of Michael Sherrill, who published a magazine called The Californians. It's the magazine of California history. And ultimately, I got a hold of him, and we republished those stories in Ranch and Riata, as they were not stories that were in any of the books. And I think there were 10 or 12 of them. That was all that they were able to get out of him at the time. But I mean, right up to the end, he was championing the vaquero and the early culture so that it just wouldn't be forgotten. And I felt that was really important to continue that. And it's so much like what you do in Eclectic Horseman, where you are, you focus on tradition based skills, but work with people who have a contemporary understanding of them and make them available for people today with adjustments that they came along. I mean, it would have been interesting to see Tom Dorrance and Arnold Rojas talk together. Yeah. I know that Sheila Varian, the Arabian horse breeder, had Rojas come to a ranch regularly to float teeth. And he'd be there for 2 to 3 weeks living in his little Datsun pickup that had a little camper shell in the back. And so she'd have to feed him, which was he was riding the grub line, so what the heck. But she said he was absolutely fascinating and always was respectful of other people's perspectives on working horses. But he would always have a story that would kind of bring to light something if there was a shortcoming or something that they wanted to do. So this was a really smart man who had little to no education. When he had that stable in the late 30s up to right after the Second World War, he'd feed people that would come in because there were a lot of folks who didn't have jobs. And this one fellow that was there was so happy that he got fed by this guy. He brought him back a box full of the classics, Cervantes and I'm trying to think of Homer and all books that were basis for a lot of literary education. And that's how he got his style of writing, was following the classics and then being able to keep the voice of the people who were telling him the stories in his books. As you said, his voice is very apparent, but it's very respectful. There's never any condescension about his subject. So he's a really fascinating guy. I think he's probably arguably one of the most important Latino writers of the last century, and who has really gone, I don't know, somewhat unsung. I mean, I think in our culture, in the horse culture, I think people are respectful of him and like it, reading him, because there's nothing else like it. But for Joe Bag of Donuts general public, I don't know if they really know who he is. But he's an important writer of a culture that was just on the edge of disappearing, I think.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think, for you personally, what is it about the culture that resonates so strongly? I mean, for you to pursue keeping these in print for 10 years, I mean, that has to come from in your heart. So what is it about it that resonates so deeply with you?
Living where I live in the Santa Ynez Valley, which is a pretty, kind of sort of the birthplace of the bridle horse culture here in California. It is a tradition based on time and respect. I mean, you have to go back. I've been a student of this for a long time, and you have to go back to when you see the mission lands that were secularized in the early 1830s and distributed to important military people from Mexico. And the native Indians that were here suddenly became important as ranch workers, and they had time, they had grass, and they had water. And so they had a lot of time between working cows and moving them around to be able to perfect these skills. And it's just so fascinating to think that you could literally ride from, for folks who know California, from Ventura to Carmel and never get out of the canopy of oak trees and never hit a fence. So that and the idea that there was great respect for the horse, where it was always about putting the horse first. Certainly the skills were there, well, I have a very light rein on this horse. Okay, well, I am using a thread. Okay, well, I'm not going to use a bridle at all. So there was this happy competitiveness. I just found that so attractive and so compelling. And then to suddenly see in the late 70s, early 80s, what Ray Hunt was doing, what Tom Dorrance was doing. I met Buck Brannaman in the early 80s, and we started working together. And I got the link between what it meant to be an effective human being, not just as a riding horses, but having respect for everything that you dealt with. I found that admirable, attractive, and something that I wanted to emulate. So when I suddenly found these people like Rojas or DeYoung, who came from those eras where they couldn't really communicate beyond their own community, I felt they needed to be celebrated. And we in the publishing business, just as you do, there's a lot easier ways to make a living, but when you are celebrating a culture you love and the people in that culture that you love, it's pretty easy to get hooked up with them. So
Yeah.
I'm stuck.
You and me both. Well, and it's so fascinating. I mean, the appeal, the international appeal to the culture and the history, it's mind-boggling in some ways, but it's so beautiful that
Yeah.
people in Germany are interested in the vaquero tradition, and so it is there is something there that resonates universally.
It's pretty heroic. I mean, I don't care where you come from. In today's world, the cowboy is somewhat degraded by the public media. You call somebody a cowboy, then it means they're not following rules, which I find a little insulting. But that cowboy culture that we have is our root-based culture, if you will. We own it. It belongs to us. These hats are either, it's either a crown or a target wherever you go. So it's wonderful to see international relations with parts of the American culture that are celebrated pretty much universally. When people really start looking at horses and what kind of relationship they want to have. So I think it's hard to put into words how attractive it is, but I think it really is a very attractive thing for other people to look at that part of America and see something that finally does have a tradition to it. I mean, we're always accused of not having traditions for being such a young country, but this is pretty impressive, and it's pretty easy to see how people, I think, get so interested in it.
Yeah. Well, and it is uniquely American in the way that it is so multicultural with the
Right.
Native Indians and the all of that, that melting pot idea, which I think a lot of people miss when they think about the archetypal cowboy and not the vaquero.
Right, exactly. I don't think that's why I think to some degree Yellowstone did a bit of a disservice to the image, because there's not a lot of murder that goes on ranches today. And I get it. I mean, everybody's tough and hairy chested. I get it, because that's TV. But when you really look at the people who make a living on horseback, and there's still quite a few who have to get up before dawn and put a foot in a stirrup and ride out and get a day's work done. And ideally, you're going to keep that horse between your knees as you're doing it. I'm always fascinated with so much imagery of bucking horses as symbols of the West, which is precisely the thing we're trying to avoid. But it's the romance. And so
Yeah.
there's a certain amount of it that you got to accept, but at the same time, I think there's a respect due to people like Rojas and certainly the foundation that Tom and Ray and everybody else's generations that are coming up and new people who are getting involved in that. That's admirable
Mhm.
and worth supporting.
Mhm. And as the land that we ride on gets smaller and smaller, and the opportunities for people to have like the authentic experience that he's describing is further and further away, that having those stories where we can experience it secondhand gives us an idea of what the horse is capable of, and that partnership.
Well, and how just front and center the horse was. I remember talking with Ernie Morris, who illustrated vaqueros, the cover of this one, vaqueros and buckaroos, and he knew Rojas really well, and they would sit and giggled with each other about the idea that today, people sit in an air-conditioned pickup and put their horses in a stock trailer and drive 13 miles to the works versus long trotting at sunrise. And as I said, well, Ernie, everything evolves. And he says, well, sometimes that's not good.
I can hear him say that.
So he was pretty happy with what he did, and but that was the reason he did his books as well.
Mhm.
He didn't want things to be forgotten, and they were all his perspective, but his braiding work, his hair rope work, everything that Ernie did celebrated his grandfather and his family and the people he knew and worked with as a child. So there's just not that many of those first generation types, who really rode for a living, or it was really essential for the day's work to get done. So, we have Ernie's books, we've got Jack Swanson's paintings, we've got Rojas's works, and so many others that we just all have to kind of go, okay, let's not forget, don't forget, this is where we came from. And you may not be able to have a big cavy of horses that you go out and rope in the morning, but you've got your one horse and you step on and you get out and do what you're going to do and get a job done. You're a part of it. You got the jersey, you're on the team. And that's really encouraging, I think, especially when it's so hard and so expensive for folks to own horses today. And as you said, land is, suddenly getting fenced, or in our country, it's grapes. And we have plenty of wine. My comment is, we got enough wine. We don't need to turn much more grazing land into vineyards. Thank you very much. But it is, you get your horse vine broke riding up and down the rows of vines, I guess. But it's everything changes, but there's the basis for it, that personal relationship with the horse and you and other people who love that's still going really strong, and I don't see that waning at all.
Good. You sort of answered my question there. I was gonna ask, like, what are we without Rojas? Like, what do we miss? I think if these books aren't available, if they had gone out of print, what do we miss? But I think you answered that pretty well there.
I don't think we should be fatalistic about the future of the culture. There was a period there where I was kind of, I don't know about this, but I'm really encouraged by the young people today who are, I'll give you a good example. I went to the first poetry gathering in Elko, I think it was 84, 85. And it was a pretty horseback deal. I mean, people would, it was at that little convention center in Elko, and literally people would ride into town horseback, tie their horse to the bumper of somebody's pickup, go in and do some poems or sing, come back out, step on and go home. And it was a pretty interesting thing to watch that. Obviously, it's become very corporate and evolved today into a big part of promoting Nevada. Harry Reid's was the former senator was very supportive of it. Always made sure Nevada gave money to that. But after all these years, 30 something years, whatever it is, now you see kind of a new little thing with this outside circle group of young people who don't have, the record industry's changed so much. There's no, it's all social media and online and EPs. So they figured out a way to create another little event that, whether it takes away from the original, I don't know, but that's what evolution does. I mean, you find out what subsequent generations need and how they want to look and how they want to do it. But at the same time, they still look back very respectfully at these origins, because that's the basis for what they're going to do with their horses. Mm-hmm. So all the trappings, all of the entertainment, all of the communication will evolve, but it's still you and the horse. And you're still going to have to get a job done. And you see all of these custom saddle people. There's so many people in the bit and spur business today. Social media has done nothing but help that and get people exposed. There's so much music out there. There's so much writing. So in that sense, it's really just a question of difference of delivery, when the basic information and the basic intent, and I think that's the best description, the intent to communicate is being enhanced. So it's all out there, and it's, the internet, you can find anything, which sometimes isn't very good, but it's there. And so to be able to have started something with reprinting all those books, it's encouraging to me that so many people still want to learn. They still want to know. So I feel very encouraged ongoing that this culture is going to survive. It will be a little different. It will have someone else's handprints on it, but the basis for it, I think will survive and will thrive.
Awesome. Well, that's encouraging to hear. That's encouraging. Well, I have a feeling that you and I could probably visit all day, but is there any question on these books and Rojas in general that I didn't ask you that I should have asked you?
No, I don't think so. I think it's covered. I think the thing that's important is that this fellow, who really came from nothing, and even with the success of the books early on, I mean, I think they printed 1,000 copies when they were printed. He had a whole bunch of different people giving money to do that, and he would go around and sell them, but he would also tell the stories live. And just as what you do with Eclectic Horseman, you're a storyteller. You communicate about a life that you're passionate about and that your readers are passionate about. And I think if there's a message, we need more Rojases of today. We need people to take these stories, take the methodology, the honesty, and the competency of working with horses today. And how is that going to evolve? People shouldn't be afraid to say, I got this idea. What do you think? Well, it may not work. It may work. But I think everything has to grow. And, for what Rojas did, it had its place. What example of Louis Ortega did with his books, they had their place. But even with Ortega's principal work of braiding, that's still very sought after. So there's an understanding of where all this came from and that importance. And from there, I think we can build on it. So I just see a very positive future, and we have people like Arnold Rojas to thank for getting the ball rolling.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much today for visiting with me today about this, and we'll get together again and visit about some of your other fantastic books.
Well, I look forward to it, and thanks so much, Emily. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bill. You have a great rest of your day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.